Sacred Heart Hospital in Philadelphia hums with fluorescent lights and antiseptic burn at 3 in the morning. Danielle Ross moves through the ER like a ghost, invisible, competent, unremarkable in her faded blue scrubs that have been washed so many times the fabric feels like silk against her skin. She carries a cracked navy mug filled with cold coffee, a dying succulent perched on the nurse's station she waters obsessively even though everyone knows it won't survive another month. The plant never stands a chance, but she tends it anyway, the way some people tend to things that are already broken because the alternative is letting go entirely. 3 years. That's how long Danielle has worked the night shift at Sacred Heart without incident, without attention, without anyone asking questions about the scar that runs from her collarbone to her shoulder blade, visible only when she reaches for supplies on the high shelves. Her colleagues know her as the quiet one. The competent one. The nurse who apologizes too much. "My apologies, doctor," she says when a resident brushes past her in the hallway. "So sorry to bother you," she murmurs when she needs clarification on an order. The words are lies, but they're the kind of lies that keep people safe. They're the kind of lies that keep her invisible. Her hands tell a different story. Those hands have held lives together in ways that would make most nurses weep. During a mass casualty drill 3 months ago, she organized triage with a precision that made the attending physician pause mid-instruction, watching her move between gurneys with the fluid efficiency of someone who had already done this in significantly worse conditions. She caught the moment his eyes widened with recognition of something he couldn't quite name, and she immediately ducked her head, mumbled an apology, made herself small again. "So sorry, doctor. I shouldn't have stepped in like that." The attending had nodded, dismissing the moment, dismissing her, moving on to the residents who actually belonged in the room. That's the dance. That's the mask. Danielle Ross, night shift nurse at Sacred Heart, lives and breathes in a register of calculated meekness that would suffocate most people. But she's not most people, and the meekness isn't natural. It's practiced. It's armor disguised as weakness. It's a skill she learned the same way she learned to place and fall blindfolded by muscle memory alone, through repetition, through failure, through doing it when the stakes were highest and nobody was watching to see her get it right. The dog tag beneath her scrubs catches on the fabric when she moves. Single piece of worn metal on a broken chain, the engraved name so smooth from a decade of worried touches that it's barely readable anymore. She touches it sometimes during her break, sitting in the bathroom stall with the door locked, her thumb tracing what used to be letters. Nobody sees that. Nobody sees any of it. On a Tuesday night in September, she takes a wrong turn looking for the supply closet and finds herself in front of the restricted records room. The lock beeps open when she swipes her ID, a mistake in the system, some glitch that probably should have been reported 3 years ago but wasn't, and she steps inside because the door is already open and she's human enough to be curious. File cabinets line the walls in perfect rows, each one labeled with patient codes and dates. Her eyes scan across the files without meaning to, reading the spines the way most people read billboards on the highway, automatic and unconscious. Until she sees them. Department of Defense seals. 3 of them. Patient files marked with the kind of classification code she hasn't seen since Tikrit, since a dusty compound where the stakes were measured in hostage lives and political careers. Her hand stops mid-reach. Her breathing stops. The fluorescent lights buzz overhead like insects trapped in amber, and for exactly 3 seconds, she forgets how to perform the role of Danny the nurse and remembers what it felt like to be someone else entirely. The door opens behind her. Danielle. Dr. Caldwell's voice carries the particular tone of a man who has just caught someone where they shouldn't be. His eyes are sharp, surgical in their assessment, they flick from her face to the open file cabinet to her hand frozen in midair. He's studying her the way a radiologist studies an X-ray, looking for shadows that might indicate something wrong beneath the surface. "What are you doing in here?" She stammers an excuse. The words come out fractured, apologetic, wrong. I took a wrong turn, I shouldn't have." She pulls her hand back, makes herself smaller, does everything right to exit this moment as quickly and invisibly as possible. But she's already made the mistake. She's already looked at the files too quickly. She's already shown him that she knows what those seals mean, that she recognizes classification codes that a night shift nurse from Philadelphia shouldn't recognize at all. Caldwell doesn't move. He just watches her leave, his expression unreadable as she brushes past him into the hallway. She doesn't see the way his jaw tightens, doesn't see the calculation that blooms across his face like a dark flower opening in fast motion. She keeps walking, her footsteps soft against the tile, her heart making noise she's certain everyone in the hospital can hear. It's not fear. Fear is what civilians experience. This is something older, something that lives in her chest like a second heartbeat. This is recognition of a threat that has just identified her. The next evening, Caldwell is waiting for her at the nurse's station when she arrives for her shift. "Danielle," he says, his voice smooth as oil. "Could you help me with something in the med bay?" There's nothing unusual about the request. Nothing that should make her spine straighten or her pulse quicken. But she's trained to read the subtext of violence, and she hears it in his tone, not a request, but a setup. A performance staged for the benefit of the other nurses pretending not to listen. She follows him into the medication dispensary. He closes the door. The fluorescent lights flicker once, casting his face in shadow for a fraction of a second. "I've been reviewing your file," he says, not looking at her. "Notice some inconsistencies. Your background check seems sparse. Incomplete, really. Which is odd for someone who's been here 3 years." He's watching her now, his eyes bright with the kind of interest that predators show when they've identified weakness in prey. "And then I find you in the restricted records room. The one that's supposed to be locked. The one you shouldn't have access to." Danielle's hands remain still. Not trembling. Not twitching. Steady as a surgeon's hands before the first incision. It was an accident. The door was open. "I apologize, Doctor. I shouldn't have." "No," Caldwell interrupts, a thin smile spreading across his face like a crack in concrete. "You shouldn't have. And you certainly shouldn't have recognized those files the way you did. I saw your face, Danielle. That wasn't the face of someone seeing something for the first time." He steps closer, close enough that she can smell his cologne and the coffee on his breath. "So here's what's going to happen. You're going to be very careful about what you do and where you go. You're going to remember that you work for me. And if I ever catch you near those files again, or if I ever get the sense that you've spoken to anyone about what you saw, there won't be a second conversation. There will just be a termination letter." The threat hangs in the air between them like humidity before a storm. Danielle nods once, the motion minimal, controlled. "Understood, Doctor." "Good." Caldwell opens the door, the moment dissolving as quickly as it appeared. "Oh, and Danielle? One more thing. I'm going to need you to answer to a new nickname from now on. Something that suits your demeanor." His smile widens, becomes something that looks less like an expression and more like a bear trap showing its teeth. "From now on, the staff will call you Danny the Disney Princess. Because you're so sweet. So helpful. So willing to just stay in your lane." He says it loud enough for the other nurses to hear. Loud enough for the residents to turn and stare. Loud enough for the nickname to stick like a burr in wool, the kind of thing that will follow her through the halls of Sacred Heart for months or years. It's the first domino. The first small move in a larger game that neither of them quite understands yet. Caldwell is checking her psychological vulnerability. Testing to see if she'll break. The next code comes at 0430 hours. Trauma Bay 2 erupts into controlled chaos when the ambulance brings in a 67-year-old male, chest trauma, unresponsive, BP dropping. The attending barks orders, but something's wrong, his hands are moving too fast, panicked, compensating for fear. The nurses respond mechanically, but there's a hesitation in the room, a collective holding of breath that says nobody here has done this under real pressure, nobody here knows what comes next. Danielle doesn't wait for instructions. Her feet move first, her hand second, her mouth third. She's already opening the 14-gauge angiocath needle when the resident notices her. She's already checking the patient's lung sounds: collapsed, right side, tension pneumothorax, the air is hissing out with every breath and the lung is folding in on itself like a fist closing. There's no time for protocols or hierarchy or the careful politeness that usually governs her movements. There's only the physics of the human body and the mathematics of what happens when pressure differential exceeds tolerance. Needle decompression, she says, not asking. Stating. Midclavicular line, second intercostal space. Now. The attending hesitates for 0.3 seconds. In a code, 0.3 seconds is a lifetime. But he nods, and Danielle's hands move with the precision of muscle memory that predates her current life by a decade and change. The needle goes in. The air hisses out, she hears it, that distinctive exhalation of pressure releasing, pain as information, pain as data. The monitor responds immediately. The heart rate drops from 142 to 118. The oxygen saturation stops its downward slide. Good, someone says. Danielle is already moving to the next problem. Already assessing. Already performing the choreography of saving a life that nobody in this room understands is performance at all. To them, she's just a competent nurse. To them, this is just another code. They don't see the way she breathes, measured and controlled. They don't see the steady hands. They don't see the muscle memory that comes from having done this in a compound in Tikrit where the equipment was worse and the stakes were higher and there was nobody to call for backup when things went sideways. By the time the patient stabilizes, Danielle has already retreated back into meekness. She's checking lines, documenting vitals, apologizing for bumping into a resident. She's the Disney princess again. But for those 7 minutes, something else had been visible in the room. Something that made the attending physician look at her twice before shaking his head and deciding he'd imagined whatever he thought he'd seen. Caldwell hears about the code within the hour. He doesn't confront her again. Not yet. But he watches. Watches the way her hands move. Watches the way she interacts with patients. Watches the way she never quite looks him in the eye anymore, the way her shoulders curve inward, the way she's become smaller and smaller with each passing shift. He's put her in a box. He's sealed the lid. His content, for now, to watch her suffocate quietly. What he doesn't understand, what he can't possibly understand, is that some people are built for boxes. Some people know how to survive in sealed spaces. Some people have been trained by the world to turn their fury into stillness, their rage into patience, their power into the softest possible kind of waiting. The dog tag beneath her scrubs catches the light when she moves, worn smooth from worried fingers, the name engraved there barely readable anymore, but she knows every letter. She knows every letter because some things, once learned, live in your hands forever. The overhead PA system crackled at 08 for 7 hours, during morning rounds when the third floor was packed with residents and patients. Danny the Disney princess to reception. Danny the Disney princess to reception. The phrase echoed through the corridor like a curse. Patients looked up from their breakfast trays. An elderly man in 412 actually smiled, thinking it was a code name for something official. The charge nurse, Margaret, winced hard enough that Danielle heard her jaw click. The nickname had been whispered before, in the break room, behind the supply stations, the kind of thing that travels on the wind. But whispered was mercy. Spoken aloud. Repeated. Over the hospital-wide system. That was execution. Danielle was checking Mrs. Chen's post-op dressing when the page came through. She didn't stop moving. Didn't flinch. Didn't turn to see the orderly smirking or the residents exchanging glances. She finished taping the gauze with the same deliberate precision she'd use on a field wound, smooth tape edges, no wrinkles, no waste. Then she set down the sterile scissors and walked toward the elevator. The walk took 42 seconds. She counted them because counting was mathematics and mathematics didn't judge. The elevator doors opened. She stepped inside alone and allowed herself one measured breath, the kind that fills the belly first, then the chest, the kind that costs something. One tear escaped. Just one. She wiped it away before the doors opened on the ground floor and she stepped into the reception area where Dr. Caldwell stood with his tablet, pretending he hadn't orchestrated the entire humiliation, pretending he was simply reviewing morning schedules. He didn't look up. You know what happens to nurses who can't follow basic protocols, Disney princess? They lose privileges. His voice had the texture of a knife being sharpened, controlled, purposeful, designed to cut clean. Danielle said nothing. She had learned long ago that silence was a weapon more powerful than words because silence made men fill the space with their own fear. Caldwell kept talking anyway, which meant he was already afraid. I checked your background, Ross. Gaps. Inconsistencies. A social security number that didn't exist before 2015. He was guessing. Making noise. But he was close enough that her heart rate didn't change, and that was the only thing that mattered. The supply closet was where he cornered her 2 days later. The door clicked shut with a kind of definitive sound that erases options. 3 metal shelves. Boxes of sterile gauze. The smell of bleach and plastic and institutional cold. Caldwell's presence filled the space like a tank idling in a garage, all potential violence held barely in check. His voice dropped, which meant he was serious now, which meant he thought he'd won. HIPAA violations are federal offenses. 1 word from me and you're not just unemployed, you're investigated. Your entire life becomes public record. He was watching her face, waiting for the tremor, the breakdown, the moment when fear did what authority couldn't. Danielle took 1 measured breath. The dog tag was cold against her sternum, worn smooth from worried fingers. I came here to disappear, she said quietly, not to threaten you. Her voice was steady as a rifle shot. Whatever you think you saw, you didn't. She looked directly at him, held his eyes, and watched his smile widen because he believed he'd neutralized her. He believed compliance meant fear. He didn't understand that compliance could be strategy. Then you won't mind the transfer, he said, already texting someone. Already making arrangements. Already certain of his victory. The parking lot demotion happened at shift change when 40 staff members were arriving for the day's shift, when the maximum number of witnesses could absorb the message. The asphalt was still wet from the overnight rain. The air smelled like exhaust and diesel and the particular metallic taste of autumn in Philadelphia, that time of year when the city goes gray and stays that way. Caldwell waited until Danielle reached her car, a beat-up Honda Civic with 187,000 miles and a Marine Corps sticker peeling off the rear bumper like a secret she'd started erasing and couldn't finish. His voice carried across the lot, cutting through the sounds of slamming car doors and overlapping conversations. Effective immediately, Ross is reassigned from emergency medicine to geriatric wound care. Performance issues. Continued evaluation required. The crowd of arriving nurses and residents went silent. That particular silence had weight. Had intention. Someone's phone captured video. Someone always did. Danielle stood beside her Honda with a cardboard box already in her arms, 3 years of the ER, compressed into supplies she'd accumulated. Trauma shears with her initials engraved on the handle. A pen from a pharmaceutical rep, a photo of a unit she wasn't supposed to have kept. She'd known this was coming. Not the specifics, but the trajectory. Caldwell's kind of malice always followed a pattern: isolation, escalation, elimination. She'd seen it before in different uniforms, different rooms, different men who believed power meant the right to destroy. 1 measured breath. Then she looked directly at Caldwell, and for just a moment, her eyes reflected something that made him take an actual step backward. You'll regret teaching me what desperation looks like, she said. Her voice was quiet as a prayer. Steady as a rifle shot. The kind of voice that made the watching nurses exchange glances because something had shifted, something underneath the surface had been glimpsed and then hidden again. She turned without waiting for his response and opened the driver's side door. The interior smelled like old coffee and the leather of 1,000 shifts. She didn't look back as she drove out of the parking lot, didn't watch Caldwell in the mirror texting his hospital board allies about security concerns and problematic employment history, didn't see him already calculating how to neutralize her before she could connect the dots between those DOD files and whatever he'd been skimming from the military contracts. 3 days of reassignment. 72 hours of the geriatric wing. Danielle restocking gauze on the 3rd floor, changing dressings on pressure ulcers, moving through her shifts like a ghost, invisible again, which was supposed to be her specialty. The geriatric patients didn't care that she was being punished. They only knew that her hands were gentle and her voice was patient, and that when they rang the call button at 3 in the morning, she came within 90 seconds every time. On the 3rd day, at 1,447 hours, the emergency sirens began to wail. The sound of an incoming ambulance wasn't unusual. The sound of 3 ambulances arriving simultaneously was. Danielle was restocking gauze when the overhead page crackled, Code Blue, ER Bay 3, Code Blue. Another page followed. All available personnel. Trauma team activation. A Navy Admiral had collapsed during a veteran ceremony at Independence Hall, full cardiac arrest in front of 200 witnesses, VF rhythm from the moment the paramedics arrived, unresponsive, no ROSC despite 23 minutes of continuous CPR. Her feet moved before her mind finished processing the information. Muscle memory. 3 years of the ER lived in her nervous system like scarring lives inside tissue. She abandoned the gauze, the dressing station, the geriatric wing entirely. A nursing assistant called out as she walked past, but Danielle was already moving toward the stairwell. The elevator would waste time. Stairs were faster. The stairwell smelled like industrial cleaner and the particular metallic echo of a concrete chamber. 6 flights down. Her footsteps were the only sound except for her own breathing, controlled, measured, the breathing of someone who understood that panic was a luxury she couldn't afford. The ER was chaos, the organized kind of chaos that happens when the system is overwhelmed. The Admiral was seizing on the gurney, vitals crashing on the monitor. 2 residents stood frozen, watching the numbers drop like they were watching a man drown and had forgotten how to swim. The attending physician was barking orders. Then Dr. Caldwell appeared in the doorway, saw the Admiral's uniform, saw the Department of Defense security detail in the hallway, and his expression shifted to something carefully blank. Danielle watched from the corner where she shouldn't have been. Watched him pull the attending physician aside. Watched their conversation, Caldwell's mouth moving, the attending's confusion shifting to reluctant agreement, then something like resignation. Within 15 minutes, every senior physician had been reassigned. Every available surgeon was suddenly needed elsewhere. Caldwell made strategic calls from the observation room, his voice smooth as oil, each phrase calculated. The Rothschild family needs the OR moved to the morning. Yes, I understand, but their donation specifically requires it. A military patient, yes, but we're a civilian facility. VA can handle it. Stabilize and transfer. A resident asked who would treat the Admiral. Caldwell's answer was surgical precision. We're a civilian facility. Let the VA handle military cases. Stabilize and transfer. But the Admiral was crashing too fast for transfer. No transfer team would take him. No VA facility could promise ROSC. The ambulance was already leaving, lights flashing, sirens wailing, a man dying because someone made phone calls. Danielle stood in the doorway of the observation window, watching doctors file away, watching a patient die because of institutional cowardice and strategic malice. The dog tag under her scrub suddenly felt heavier. Not metaphorically. Actually heavier. She closed her eyes and saw Tikrit, the burning Humvee, the screaming hostages, the moment when command had abandoned them because the mission was compromised and careers were more important than lives. She'd made a decision in that moment. Had decided that she would not let protocol kill people if she could stop it. That she would not be complicit in watching someone die. She opened her eyes. A nurse was watching her. "You're not authorized down here." Danielle kept walking toward the ER. Neither was I in Tikrit. The sirens hit Sacred Heart's bay doors at 1,447 hours on a Tuesday, the kind of sound that makes every head in the ER snap up like a single organism. Cardiac emergency. Vehicle trauma. The dispatch codes crackled through the intercom, but it was the final note that stopped conversations mid-sentence. Admiral, full collapse, Independence Hall veteran ceremony, no pulse on scene. The stretcher rolled through the automatic doors at 14:49, and the body on it wore a dress navy uniform soaked through with rain and the particular shade of blue-gray that meant anoxia had already set in. An elderly man, maybe 72, his face the color of wet cement, his chest heaving with the desperate gasping of someone whose oxygen had already started to fail. Danielle was on the 4th floor in geriatric wound care, changing a diabetic ulcer on Mrs. Chen's left heel, when the overhead page crackled, all surgical staff to main OR for emergency donor protocol. She didn't look up from the sterile dressing. Just kept her hands moving with the same precise, unhurried movement she'd perfected over 3,000 days of invisible work. But her hearing was military grade. She caught the secondary page, the one nobody else seemed to notice: resource allocation meeting, Trauma Bay 3, cancelled. Caldwell's voice underneath it, making calls in the background, something about surgical availability and elective procedures and protocol sequencing. The math was immediate. The Admiral arrived. The doctors didn't show. Someone had decided that a dying flag officer wasn't worth the hospital's resources. She finished the dressing on Mrs. Chen's heel with a final piece of silk tape and stood. "I'll be back in 10 minutes, she said quietly. The old woman nodded, already half asleep from the pain medication. Danielle walked down the 4th floor corridor moving like someone going to get coffee, not like her muscles had just switched from civilian to operational. By the time she reached the stairwell, her breathing had synchronized to a soldier's rhythm, deep, controlled, the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst the world could offer. The ER descended into controlled chaos as she pushed through the lower-level doors. 3 trauma bays were active, but Bay 3 was the one that screamed. She could hear it before she saw it, the monitor in pure V-fib, that lethal electrical pattern that means the heart isn't beating, it's just vibrating uselessly like a wind chime in a hurricane. The ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm into someone's lungs. Someone was shouting for epi. Someone else was saying they couldn't reach Dr. Harrison, couldn't reach Dr. Pierce, couldn't reach anyone with the authority to make the decisions that meant living or dying. The junior resident in Bay 3 was a kid, maybe 26, his hands shaking as he performed chest compressions on the Admiral's chest. His name tag read Chen, no relation to Mrs. Chen upstairs, but Danielle filed that away with the same automatic precision she'd used to process 1,000 other meaningless details in 100 different operating theaters across 3 continents. The resident's compressions were sloppy, panicked, the rhythm fractured by the kind of fear that came from knowing you weren't qualified for what was happening and having no one else available to take over. Danielle stood at the bay entrance for exactly 1 second. 2. The time it took her to see Admiral, male, mid-70s, presenting with acute cardiac failure, likely internal hemorrhage from blunt trauma, O2 saturation at 68% and dropping, no attending physician on scene, no surgeon routing through, no backup, just a kid with shaking hands and a dying man, and 70 seconds before the Admiral's brain started dying from lack of oxygen. Caldwell stood 50 feet away at the nursing station, his phone to his ear, his expression the satisfied smile of someone who'd just removed a problem from the board before it could metastasize. "Get him on the defibrillator," Danielle said. Her voice had changed. It wasn't the soft, apologetic tone she'd been using for 3 years. It was the kind of voice that made spine straighten without thinking. The resident's head snapped toward her. "Now." 200 joules. We called for Dr. Caldwell," he said to hold on. "Did I stutter, petty officer?" She was already moving, already grabbing the crash cart, her hands moving with the terrifying fluid precision of something that had done this in significantly worse conditions. The resident wasn't a petty officer, but the military title cut through his panic like a blade through silk. He moved. His hands found the defibrillator pads. Charging. Clear. The shock hit the Admiral's chest like a fist from God. The body arced once, twice. The monitor kept screaming. VFib. Still VFib. Still dead. Push 1 of epi, Danielle said. Her hands were already prepping the central line, the for access point they'd need if this went any longer. The resident drew the epinephrine, 1 milligram, and pushed it into the port. The drug would hit the Admiral's bloodstream, would tell his heart to wake up, would do nothing if the underlying problem wasn't solved. And she could see it in the jugular distension, in the muffled heart sounds, in the way his chest was moving with all the compression but none of the cardiac output. Internal bleed. Massive. The kind that didn't show up on the initial assessment because the trauma had been blunt, had been devastating, had been the kind of hit that separated the living from the dead in the space between one heartbeat and the next. Again, she said. 200 joules. Clear. The second shock. Nothing. The monitor kept its lethal rhythm, the blip-blip-blip of electricity going nowhere useful, of a heart that wasn't damaged but wasn't functional either. The Admiral's color had shifted now from blue-gray to the particular shade of white that meant his blood pressure had bottomed out, that his brain was on borrowed time. Caldwell appeared in the bay doorway at 1506 hours. His face was pale, not from shock, but from recognition. He saw her. He saw what she was doing. And he saw, in that moment, that she'd come back despite the parking lot humiliation, despite the reassignment, despite the fact that he'd spent the last 72 hours making sure she had nowhere to work and nothing to do. She'd come back because people dying in front of her wasn't protocol she accepted. It never had been. It never would be. Nurse Ross, he said, his voice taking on that particular edge that meant he was about to weaponize authority. You are not authorized for this patient. Step away immediately. She ignored him the way she'd ignored everything else in the last 3 years. The way she'd ignored his demeaning nickname, his public humiliation, his strategic dismantling of her position. Resident, she said. Chest compressions. Keep the rate at 100 to 120. Don't stop until I tell you. Dr. Caldwell just said. Your Admiral needs a thoracotomy in the next 60 seconds or his brain dies. I'm about to cut open his chest and repair the bleed. You can either help me or get out of my way. But pick now. The junior resident's eyes were the size of dinner plates. Thoracotomies didn't happen in hospital ERs. They happened in combat zones and desperate situations and places where protocols had already died and the only thing left was the choice between trying something impossible or accepting something inevitable. But he nodded. His hands kept moving. His rhythm stayed steady. Caldwell's voice climbed an octave. Security. I need security in Bay 3 immediately. This nurse is practicing beyond scope and refusing direct orders from the attending physician. His phone was already out, already recording, already building his documentation of her insubordination. He was smart enough to know that the only way this ended well for him was if she failed spectacularly. If she tried something outside protocol and killed the Admiral himself. If he could point and say, look, this is what happens when nurses overreach. This is why we have hierarchy. Combat knife, Danielle said to the resident, moving to the trauma kit mounted on the wall, the one that carried the equipment designed for the situations where hospitals didn't work. Inside, sterilized and ready, was exactly what she needed. A blade about the length of her hand, sharp enough to move through human tissue like it was butter. The kind of knife she'd used in field hospitals where the electricity had failed and the antibiotics were gone and the only choice left was surgery with what you had or burying another kid whose parents would never know what happened to him. If you touch him, I will have you arrested, Caldwell said. His voice was shaking now, the tremor of someone watching his narrative control slip away in real time. Security is coming. Don't make this worse. Step away from that patient. Danielle turned to look at him. One measured breath. Just one. The kind of breath that meant nothing, wasn't a hesitation, wasn't doubt, was just the physical act of moving air in and out of lungs. And then the tears came. One tear, sliding down her cheek, catching the fluorescent light like a tiny piece of glass. The resident saw it and froze, because he was young enough to still believe that crying meant defeat, that tears were a sign of breaking rather than of something else entirely. But Danielle didn't wipe it away. Didn't flinch. Didn't acknowledge it as anything other than water leaving her body while she did what needed doing. "You can arrest me after," she said to Caldwell. Her voice was steady as bedrock. Steady as a surgical laser. Steady as someone who'd already made the calculation that some things mattered more than career. "But you're not killing another one." She made the incision. Lateral thoracotomy through the fourth intercostal space, the blade moving with the precision of 8,847 hours of surgical training packed into hands that hadn't forgotten a single second of it. The Admiral's chest opened like a book, and there it was, the reason for the failed compressions, the reason for the dropping O2, the reason for the particular shade of dying he'd been performing. Internal hemorrhage. A massive bleed in the pericardial space, blood pooling around the heart like an accusation, the pressure building until the organ couldn't pump anymore. The kind of injury that killed people in hospitals with unlimited resources because it came so fast and hurt so deep that there was no time to get them to the operating room. But there was time now. 60 seconds, maybe less. Danielle's hands moved into the Admiral's chest cavity with the terrifying competence of something that had done this in worse conditions. In field hospitals outside Fallujah. In combat zones where the artillery was still incoming. In situations where the only choice between living and dying was the person standing over you and what they knew how to do with their hands. She found the source of the bleed, a coronary artery with a traumatic tear the length of her pinky nail. Minimal. Almost invisible. Absolutely fatal if left alone. "Suture," she said. The resident had already moved, already understood on some cellular level that what he was watching was either salvation or the most remarkable form of suicide he'd ever witnessed. Either way, he was going to help. The resident handed her the needle and thread, and her hands moved to close the vessel with the kind of speed that made the procedure look like a magic trick, like someone making blood stop pouring and heart start beating again just by wanting it badly enough. Caldwell's phone was still recording. His voice was still rising, still calling for security, still trying to build the narrative that could protect him from what was happening in front of his eyes. But his phone wasn't what mattered now. None of his authority mattered now. All that mattered was whether the Admiral's brain had enough oxygen to survive the next 10 seconds, and whether Danielle's hands could move fast enough to make sure it did. The clamp. The repair. The closure. 20 seconds. 30. The moment when she knew it was going to work, when the physics of the situation shifted from impossible to merely desperate, when the Admiral's heart could start beating again because the thing preventing it was gone. "Defibrillator," she said. The resident charged it without being asked. 200 joules. Clear. The shock hit. The monitor screamed. And then, underneath the chaos, there was a sound that meant everything, the blip-blip-blip of a normal rhythm. Sinus rhythm. The sound of a heart remembering how to beat all by itself. The sinus rhythm held. Steady. Clean. The kind of sound that meant a heart remembered how to beat on its own. Danielle didn't step back. Not yet. The bleeding point was still visible through the retractor, a coronary artery fragment, torn nearly clean through, the kind of damage that should have required a full cardiac surgical team and 2 hours of careful repair under perfect conditions. She had neither. The clock read 1847 hours. She'd been standing at this table for 8 hours straight. Her hands moved like a pianist who'd practiced the same piece 10,000 times. The muscle memory wasn't from textbooks. It was from Forward Surgical Team 7, from a makeshift OR in Tikrit where the power cut out twice and the only light came from a handheld mag-light duct taped to an 4-pole. Pain was information. Bleeding points were puzzles. Hands that had held lives together in a dust storm could certainly manage Philadelphia on a Tuesday night. The junior resident assisting her, a third-year named Patterson with hands that hadn't stopped shaking since the code started, followed her instructions with the precision of someone who'd just watched a miracle. She'd talked him through every step like they were the only 2 people in a room full of monitors and beeping machines and the collective weight of an entire hospital's failure pressing down from the observation window. Retractor placement, she'd said, her voice steady as surgical steel. Visualize the tear. Don't rush. Patterson nodded, trembling fingers adjusting the instrument with surprising delicacy. 14-0 proline, she continued. Single-layer repair. We're not rebuilding an engine. We're closing a leak. She paused, letting him position the needle. Exact stitches. Exact depth. Exact angles. That's how you separate competent from alive. The suture went through the artery wall with the faint resistance of living tissue giving way to surgical precision. Once. Twice. 4 times total. The tear sealed like it had never existed. The cardiac surgeon arrived at 19:02 hours, stepping through the OR doors with the kind of casual authority that came from knowing you were the most qualified person in any room. He stopped dead. His eyes moved from the monitors to Danielle's face to the open chest cavity where a coronary artery sat sealed and stable. The surgeon's jaw tightened. He said nothing. Just watched. Danielle didn't acknowledge him. She was already moving to close the chest wall, her movements efficient and practiced. The ribs came together with the small metallic clink of retractor removal. Sutures held. The skin was last, a running subcuticular closure that left only a faint pink line where 8 hours of impossible work had just saved a man's life. At 2,103 hours, the Admiral's rhythm was stable. VTAC that was becoming predictable. Pressures climbing. Core temperature rising from the bear hugger warming blanket wrapped around his exposed skin. Everything pointed toward viability. Danielle stepped back from the table and felt her hands begin to tremble. Not fear. Not doubt. The adrenaline was crashing, finally releasing from her system now that the critical window had closed. Her scrubs were soaked through, blood and sweat and the visceral proof that she'd just performed emergency cardiac surgery in a Philadelphia ER with a combat knife and a trembling surgical resident. The cardiac surgeon approached slowly. His voice was quiet, almost respectful. "Where did you train?" Danielle didn't answer. She was already pulling off her gloves. The dog tag beneath her scrubs caught slightly on the fabric, then settled back against her sternum. That broken chain had held other secrets. It could hold this one. But that wasn't the worst part. Dr. Caldwell was waiting in the hallway outside the OR. Not alone. 2 hospital board members flanked him. She recognized them from the cafeteria, the kind of administrators who made decisions about liability instead of lives. A security guard stood slightly behind, neutral expression already rehearsed. Caldwell's face had changed. The pale shock that had consumed him mid-procedure had been replaced by something far more dangerous, calculation. His mouth was set in a thin line. His eyes moved from Danielle to the board members with the precision of a prosecutor presenting evidence. Nurse Ross performed invasive surgical procedures without proper authorization, he announced, his voice carrying the rehearsed tone of someone who'd already made phone calls, already crafted his narrative. Without supervision. Without consulting attending physicians. Direct violation of scope of practice. Direct violation of explicit orders removing her from this department. One board member nodded gravely. The other mentioned liability. The third, Caldwell himself, mentioned lawsuits. Danielle watched his face with the flat composure of someone who'd seen much worse than institutional cowardice. She didn't argue. Didn't defend. Didn't explain that the Admiral would be dead if she hadn't violated every single protocol Caldwell had constructed. That wasn't information that mattered to people who measured success in contracts and risk mitigation. Your badge access is revoked effective immediately, Caldwell continued. Your employment is terminated, pending criminal investigation by the hospital's legal team. The security guard stepped forward, his expression apologetic. I need you to come with me, Am. Danielle walked. Her hands had stopped trembling by the time she reached the staff parking lot. The rain had started, not gentle rain, but the kind that hammered the asphalt like it had something to prove. She wasn't carrying much. Her locker had never held anything valuable except the things that mattered, a cracked navy mug with a submarine emblem, a dying succulent that had somehow survived 9 years of neglect, and a photograph. 12 soldiers in desert fatigue standing in front of a burning building, the kind of photo that officially didn't exist because the mission that created it had been buried at the congressional level. The dog tag hung against her collarbone on a chain that had broken years ago and never been properly fixed. The name was worn smooth from 9 years of worry. Of hiding. Of being invisible in a hospital where she'd saved enough lives to fill a small cemetery, but no one would ever know the names of the people she'd pulled back from the edge. A sedan with government plates had parked half a block away. She noticed it from the bus stop, standing in rain that soaked through her scrubs like punishment. She didn't turn to look directly. She knew what happens when classified evidence gets exposed. She knew the protocols. The handlers. The quiet disappearances that weren't really disappearances, they were just people being moved to new invisible lives, new cities where they'd never mention what they'd seen. The bus didn't come. Another sedan turned slowly onto the street, this one with different plates. She recognized the turn signal pattern, left, right, left. That was the signal. That meant they were ready. That meant her 9 years of careful invisibility were about to end in ways she couldn't control. She was wrong about what came next. The Admiral's grown son was already asking questions the moment his father's ICU chart crossed his hands at 08 for 7 hours the next morning. Still wearing his own Navy service dress uniform from the ceremony where his father had collapsed, he had the particular intensity of military family members who recognized the difference between hospital standard responses and actual answers. "I need the surgical team," he'd said to the charge nurse, his voice carrying the weight of rank that wasn't actually his to claim but seemed to work anyway. Every name. Every credential. The charge nurse's hands had shaken as she pulled the post-op report. The moment she saw Danielle's name, crossed out but still visible beneath Caldwell's hasty deletion, her face had gone pale. The automatic flag on the file. The classified security clearance warning. The federal alert that had triggered overnight because someone with a Department of Defense security clearance had performed emergency surgery in a non-military facility. Major Ross, the son had said, stopping mid-breath. Not a question. A recognition. That was the moment everything accelerated beyond Caldwell's ability to control it. Caldwell's hands moved with surgical precision through the hospital's digital records, each keystroke a calculated deletion. File names vanished. Surgery logs rewrote themselves. The evidence of Danielle's 8-hour thoracotomy, the timeline, the procedure notes, the emergency override codes, dissolved into the void like it had never existed. His office door locked. His fingers flew across the keyboard with the competence of someone who'd learned to erase inconvenient truths long before he ever held a scalpel. The Admiral's post-op file now listed an attending physician who'd been in the cafeteria at 2:02 a.m. The system accepted the lie without question. By 3:15, Danielle's computer access flatlined. Her credentials locked. Her authentication credentials, gone. She was still an employee for exactly 47 more minutes. After that, she would be untethered. Caldwell picked up his phone. The board members took his calls immediately. They always did. "We have a problem," he said into the receiver, his voice carrying the confidence of a man who'd solved 100 problems this way before. An RN in geriatric care performed an unscoped procedure. Cardiac intervention. Without supervision. The pause on the line was brief. He could hear them calculating, liability, exposure, deniability. "I'm recommending immediate termination," Caldwell continued. "Before she contaminates any investigation with her narrative." The voice on the other end of the line belonged to Board Chair Harrison, whose family had received consulting fees from the same DOD contracts that had recently become irregular. "How soon?" Harrison asked. "Tonight," Caldwell said. "Before the Admiral's family arrives. Before anyone connects her name to anything that matters." He hung up. The machinery activated. Institutional power moving like a hydraulic press, slow, inevitable, impossible to stop once engaged. Security arrived at Sacred Heart's main entrance at 11:56 p.m., walking the night shift with their eyes trained on the staff locker room. The termination letter had already been processed, timestamped, filed with witnesses. Danielle was pulling off her scrubs when they found her, still soaked, the salt stains of 8 hours under fluorescent lights mapped across the fabric like a geography of her own exhaustion. "We need you to collect your personal items," the lead officer said. His name tag read Rodriguez. He wouldn't meet her eyes. Nobody met her eyes anymore. She moved with the mechanical efficiency of someone who'd already accepted this ending before it arrived. The cardboard box came from the break room recycling bin. It was softer than it should have been, already half collapsed, patched with electrical tape. She placed her items inside with deliberate care. A cracked navy mug, the glaze chipped from years of 3 a.m. coffee stations across a dozen posts. A dying succulent in a plastic pot, its leaves papery and curled, something she'd tried to keep alive the way other people kept photographs. The photo from Tikrit, 17 faces arranged in front of a compound wall, everyone wearing expressions that said they understood what they were standing in front of was not supposed to exist. And the dog tag, still on its broken chain, the name worn so smooth from 13 years of touching, from worry and prayer and desperate hope, that you could barely read the letters anymore. The chain had snapped 3 days after, she'd never replaced it, couldn't replace it. Some things break for a reason. Rodriguez walked 2 steps behind her toward the parking lot. The rain fell like someone was throwing water from a fire truck, the kind of Philadelphia rain that soaked through everything and made the asphalt shine like wet glass. Her scrubs clung to her skin. The cardboard box began to soften immediately, the bottom starting to give way under the weight of ordinary objects suddenly transformed into the sum total of a life that shouldn't end this way. She didn't ask for an umbrella. She didn't ask for anything. The bus stop was 6 blocks, but they drove her there because that was protocol now, witness the employee departure, confirm she left the property, document everything. Rodriguez pulled to the curb at 12:04 a.m. The fluorescent shelter light hummed above the bench, attracting insects that spiraled in tight geometric patterns. The next bus was listed as arriving in 18 minutes. She sat down. The cardboard box was dissolving. She pulled it closer to her chest, the way someone holds something that's dying and there's nothing left to do but bear witness. A bus came at 12:16 a.m. It was heading downtown, not toward her apartment. It decelerated, and she stood without thinking, the box already crumbling in her hands. The driver saw her, saw the scrubs, saw the soaked hair, saw the cardboard falling apart, and his face made a choice. His foot moved to the accelerator instead of the brake. The splash of water that came from the street hit her like a slap, soaking the box completely, destroying the photo in one gesture, spreading the soil from the dying succulent across her stomach. The bus disappeared around the corner with a hiss of hydraulic air, leaving her standing at the stop with pieces of her life falling into the gutter. She didn't move. The rain continued. The next bus was listed as arriving in 23 minutes. She stood there anyway, because sitting down with a dissolving box of everything you own teaches you something about dignity that you can't learn any other way. The dog tag hung around her neck under her scrubs, the name worn smooth, the chain broken. Nobody knew what it meant. Nobody knew who it belonged to. Nobody knew that she'd kept it for 13 years because some promises don't have expiration dates, and some people don't get to come home, and sometimes the only way to honor them is to disappear yourself, to become so small and so quiet that the world forgets you ever existed at all. The streetlight above her flickered, and for a moment the rain looked like it was falling upward instead of down. She closed her eyes. One measured breath. Then another. The kind of breathing they teach you in places where making a sound could get people killed. The kind of breathing that sounds like nothing from the outside, but on the inside feels like an entire war happening in your chest, and you're winning because nobody can see it. She had no way to know that the Admiral was waking in ICU recovery, asking the charge nurse about the woman who'd saved his life, that the name Danielle was being connected to security footage, that somewhere in the hospital's digital systems Marcus Chen, a Marine Corps IT director serving as a contractor, was preserving every single file that Caldwell had tried to erase. She had no way to know that she'd just walked through the exact moment everything was about to change, that standing in the rain at a bus stop in Philadelphia at 12:04 a.m. was the lowest point of a fall that was about to become a resurrection. For now, there was only the rain. The broken chain under her wet scrubs. The cardboard box falling apart. The dog tag with a name worn smooth by 13 years of mourning. And the knowledge that she'd done everything right, saved a life, protected a secret, followed the codes that had kept her alive, only to discover that doing everything right sometimes looks exactly like being destroyed. The next bus would arrive in 19 minutes. She would stand there and wait. She would board it when it stopped. She would go to a motel 6 miles from Sacred Heart Hospital and sit on a sagging mattress and hold the dog tag and try to remember what it felt like to be someone the world was allowed to know. But that wasn't the end. That was only the beginning of what happened next. If you're enjoying the story so far, hit that like button. And I'd love to know, drop a comment telling us where you're watching from.